Well, hello. Welcome to the Conduit Club and this On Frontline discussion, and welcome also to those of you who are watching online. I'm Chris Morris. I was a foreign correspondent with the BBC for a long time, and I now do various things, including presenting these panels. Today, as you know, we're going to be talking about migration. It's a big topic, as we've been discussing, and we'll welcome questions on all aspects that we can try and answer, but I think we're going to start with a focus on crossings of the Mediterranean, which, as you know, kind of flit in and out of the headlines when something terrible happens, but are very, very quickly forgotten. And we shouldn't forget that people are actually dying every week trying to cross the Mediterranean. So let me introduce my panel. From on the far side, we have Ravishaan Rahel Muthiah, who is from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, the migrants' rights charity, which for more than 50 years now has been campaigning for the rights of asylum seekers and refugees in the UK. Katy Fallon is a journalist based in Athens. She works for The Guardian, for Al Jazeera English, and has done a lot of work recently on migration, with a particular focus on human rights abuses at Europe's border. And then next to me is Ben Judah. I did have a copy of his book, but I've dropped it somewhere. There's lots at the back there. Ben is a journalist and author, and his most recent book, which you can buy at the end of this session, is This Is Europe, The Way We Live Now, is the subtitle, which is basically stories which people tell in their own words, and many of them inevitably are, in one way or another, stories about migration. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for a few minutes to begin with. We'll have a bit of discussion on stage, and then, of course, we will stage, you know what I mean, chairs. And then we'll obviously take questions from the audience. Katy, can we start with you? Because you're based in Greece, which obviously has been a focus of the most recent large-scale tragedy, the sinking early last month, wasn't it, of a trawler in which hundreds of people lost their lives, many of them from Pakistan. I know you've been doing some follow-up into that tragedy. What's the situation now, and how many similar situations, but on a smaller scale, have we just missed in the headlines altogether?
I mean, of that scale, it was kind of unprecedented, but tragedies like that occur almost not every week, but very, very frequently, and they don't make it into the headlines. So obviously it happened 14th of June, and we still don't know. I mean, it's a rough estimate of over 700 people who were on that boat, but obviously there's not a passenger list, so we don't know. I mean, the UN estimates there's 500 plus people still missing. There were 104 people rescued. There were also apparently women and children on the boat, but none survived. So, yeah, I mean, the state of play around that is that there's an investigation been opened into what happened. It's supposed to be top secret, so we don't know what's happening. There's a lot of testimony which which asks a lot of questions about what happened in that night, why a rescue wasn't performed earlier, what happened around the sinking of this boat. I spoke to a number of survivors who say that there was an attempt to tow the boat. But again, there's just a lot of questions. Greek authorities deny that any towing took place, and they say that this will be resolved, hopefully, by an investigation. As for the people themselves, I spent quite a lot of time with a few survivors. Many are still now some are still in Greece, some have left Greece. I think a few have returned home. I know at least one who's gone back to Pakistan, but I know of a few people still in the camp with no idea what comes next. A lot of these guys really believed that they were going to fly to Italy from Libya. They paid thousands and thousands. Some people sold their homes, and they really had no idea. So a few of the guys I spoke to are now in Greece, and they're trying to figure out how they, get over this trauma. I mean, a lot of them still can't sleep because every night they think they're drowning, and the sight of water is really difficult for them, and now they have to they have asylum processes ongoing, and yeah, I mean it's kind of in many ways quite bleak, but quite representative of the situation for many people, not just in Greece but across many countries in Europe who are in this situation. But this one particularly was so awful because so many people saw this boat before it sunk, right? You know, you have the images from Frontex, the EU Coast Guard and Border Agency, who photographed it from above. There was other cargo ships who threw supplies onto the boat. So, I mean, this was a disaster that was witnessed by many, many people. It was kind of, so there's many questions which remain about why it sunk, why people weren't rescued before. But we're waiting to see what happens with the investigation. There's different discussions about whether it should actually be Greek authorities investigating themselves or whether it should be an independent organization. But yeah, I mean, obviously on the human level, you have all these people who are now who've all lost friends and family too. I mean, the survivors came with brothers-in-laws, close friends. Yeah, so yeah, that is how things are currently with that specific one. And as you mentioned, it's just one of many, many different stories that don't get told, and many, many missing people who don't make it onto the news.
Rav, I mean, obviously your organisation works primarily in the UK, but all these stories start in countries of origin, don't they? And I guess a lot of people who do reach the UK arrive traumatised from experiences such as this.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking to hear that. My voice is wavering a little bit, and I think a lot of our clients have been through many similar situations. I think it's also important, I think, today to share a bit of a personal story, which explains why I'm in this room here today with all of you. And I guess it's because on the flip side of all of the people that perish in the Mediterranean and in the Channel, some people do survive. But to be honest, everyone should be surviving. But 40 years ago on Sunday in July, it was Black July in Sri Lanka. And this was a pogrom of an anti-Tamil pogrom, which led to Tamil businesses being burnt down by Sinhalese people, the majority people in Sri Lanka. It led to thousands of people dying. And one of the businesses that were burnt down was my grandparents' business. It was their printing business. They were printing newspapers and leaflets just for the community. And that was the moment where they decided that they couldn't stay anymore. They decided they couldn't live in that country anymore, and they had a young family to bring up. So this is what leads to a lot of people deciding that they can no longer live in their country of origin, that they have to take a perilous and treacherous journey. Now, 40 years ago for my grandparents, it was a lot easier. They were, I'm not just going to say they were welcome to this country, because they weren't fully welcome. There was a lot of racism in society, but they were able to come here a lot easier than the people that are trying to, flee similar human rights violations are now. They came here, they were able to be part of the community, be part of our society. Both of them took jobs. One was a teacher, the other was a local public servant, and they were able to be part of society and build communities. And that's why I'm here right now. And it's heartbreaking that, people across the world, whether it is still Sri Lanka, whether it's Afghanistan or Pakistan, as we saw in the Mediterranean, they're just trying to survive. They're looking for a route out. They're looking to survive. They think that what's ahead of them is much better than what they're leaving behind. And unfortunately, because of the border systems that we have, because of the asylum and immigration systems that we have in Europe, when they get here, and also because of the traffickers that take advantage of them, when they get here, they're put onto a boat and their life is a 50-50 chance or even less that they'll survive. So it's totally heartbreaking. And that is, one of the stories of, someone surviving. But nowadays, 40 years later, people don't have that same opportunity. We need to really look at our immigration and asylum system across Europe, across the world, really. We need an international response so people aren't perishing in our oceans.
And it's worth mentioning numbers, although statistics obviously never tell the whole story. I think the latest numbers I've seen from the UN is 110,000 people have crossed the Mediterranean, refugees and migrants, so far this year. But in coming to the sort of thing you write about in your book, that's 110,000 stories, isn't it? It's not. We sometimes get lost in the numbers, and these are all people.
Well, definitely. I first wanted to kind of begin my remarks by first sort of saying thank you to everybody on the panel for everything you've done in terms of human rights and journalism, because I really think, especially when it comes to migration, you know, these kind of works and endeavours really is a kind of a radical attempt to resist the forces of dehumanisation which are really shaping our world and our perceptions of them. And one of them is this sort of abstraction. It becomes incredibly easy to look at the phenomenon of migration as simply a number, as simply a statistic, and it really isn't. And one of the things that I have been trying to do in this book, This is Europe, is to find a way to crack how these stories are presented and to crack the mould. And there's been a long tendency in writing about the continent and writing about its changes over the last century. It's a genre that comes from the Victorian era, which is to have the travel writer, usually a kind of posh British male that sort of wanders around and sort of meets people and basically judges them. Either he judges them positively, sort of damn fine chap, or he sort of makes fun of them. You know, a lot of sort of Colin Fouberon writing. I'm not sure if he even enjoys going to Siberia. He seems to have gone to sort of make fun of people. And I had this sense that if we're going to see Europe clearly for what it is and how it's changing, you need to kill the travel writer. It's no longer really an appropriate way to write about others in the 21st century, especially in Europe, when we live in a mass travel, mass tourism, mass information, mass Instagram, constant bombardment age. So the book that I wrote is Europe seen through 23 different people's eyes without me. I'm not there. You know, it's there from their perspectives as far as possible, showing you what it's like for them to cross the Mediterranean, to fight on the front lines of Ukraine, to narrowly survive forest fires, to work in for deliveries for Amazon in Berlin. And you know, what I was really trying to do was allow people in the audience to cut through that level of abstraction. So when we think about the great phenomenon of migration, we don't think of it as simply numbers. But, you know, numbers are important, so I'm going to read a few now. I'm afraid I'm still not good enough at memorising them or off by heart. But I think it's important to remember that Europe really is being transformed by migration, that really a new continent is being created here. So let's kind of start with some of them that I find, really striking. Which is let's take the kind of most recent ones. We've had over 1 million asylum seekers last year entering the EU, Switzerland, and Norway. That's a huge amount of people. But that's part of a long trend that's seen, migration transform the continent. Let's have a look at France, for example. France in 1950 was 0.5% Muslim. Today it's 10% Muslim. That's a complete transformation of what France is. That's a new France. Look at Germany. The German government estimates that 17% of its population have migrated there since 1950. That's a new Germany. You're not going to understand it with your old images of what that country is. And let's have a look at a lot of our assumptions about ourselves. We have an assumption in Europe we're not migration countries. A lot of German or French politicians built their whole careers saying this is not a migration country. I remember Angela Merkel saying that not too long ago. If we look at the percentages, actually 14% of the UK population is foreign born, the same as America. Now let's look at Germany, 16%, higher than America. Let's look at Ireland. Ireland, the great country of emigration, is 18% foreign born. So these are really becoming new societies. I think it's so important to listen to the people coming, to open your eyes. And then there's migration within Europe, which is absolutely striking. 17 million Europeans, EU European, shall we say, live and work in another EU country or the UK. That would make them, I think, that's the same population as the Netherlands. So there's a whole population the size of the Netherlands, that are Euro migrants within the EU. That's 4% of the population. And a new kind of European is literally being born. There are over 1 million babies that can be traced back to the Erasmus scheme over the last 3 decades. So what I wanted to do in that book was kind of bring all of the different trends and voices of that new Europe and let people listen to them without a sort of a travel writer, kind of judging and adjudicating and telling people what to think. I thought that was a kind of exciting and new way to write about the way we live now.
Does Greece fit into that narrative in terms of a society which feels transformed, or is it a society which feels in some ways under siege and not supported by other parts of Europe as a country on the front line, like Italy, where so many people arrive, but other countries in Europe fail to support them in terms of giving refuge?
Well, I think it would probably depend who you spoke to, but I mean, certainly there's a narrative that some people would say that, you know, which is true to an extent, that Greece is a so-called frontline country for arrivals. It's one of the first places people arrive. So for a while, particularly when some of the camps were really growing in huge size, for example, Moria and Lesbos, when I was there, well, it was 3 years ago before it burned down. It was 20,000 people at one point living in a space for 3,000. So there was a strong argument for some Greeks and Greek authorities saying they felt left alone. But people leave Greece quite well. Quickly, it depends, but people largely don't want to stay in Greece. Some people do. But you'll find that, I mean, most people talk about Germany still, even though the Balkan route is shut, even though people can't walk through as easily, although they still do, you know, even though the borders are effectively shut, people dream of Northern Europe because they have this idea in their head that it's more prosperous or whatever. And I think this idea is perpetuated not just by Greece, but other countries by the treatment they feel they receive or whatever. But for sure, Greece has been left alone in some senses to deal with this. It isn't fair that one country just should be expected to deal with huge numbers of arrivals, that their arrivals are significantly down for different reasons. But yeah, there's definitely an argument which is ongoing in the EU. I mean, Greek authorities, the Greek migration minister will frequently appear in Brussels and say, you know, Greece wants a fair system where allocation happens, you know, and obviously there's some countries such as Hungary or Poland where that's less appealing and they can't kind of push through those policies or don't want to. But certainly Greek society, I mean, I'm not Greek, so I'm speaking from an outsider's perspective in some ways. It's my home, but I mean, Greece is also a country of migration and, you know, there's been a long history there as well. So it's not a new thing in some ways, but obviously the arrivals of 2015, 2016 really, I mean, especially on the small islands like Lesbos, really did transform those communities. I mean, there's a strong memory there still of people arriving and there was a lot of solidarity, but it did take a toll for sure. But how things will be in the future, we don't know. I mean, it's becoming, at least from a government level, there's a very strong anti-migration narrative. Migration is blamed for many issues. You know, it's talk of building fences, securitization, making sure people don't arrive. There's illegal pushbacks of people from land. So you have a very different kind of Greece in some ways to the one it was in 2015, 2016.
Rav, I mean, the UK is obviously a long way from the shores of the Mediterranean, but presumably quite a lot of the people who cross to the UK on small boats have already risked their lives crossing the Mediterranean on a boat as well. I mean, it's in many ways a story of extraordinary resilience, but how much does the UK policy get impacted by what happens in the Mediterranean?
I mean, I guess building on what you were just saying, Katie, I think there's a big difference between the political class across Europe and the people across Europe. Like you said, there was lots of signs of solidarity, right? And even in the UK, we see a lot of signs of solidarity among people. However, the political class, and in terms of, you know, how much is a political class's policy affected by what happens in the Med, at the moment, I think this government's agenda when it comes to migration is totally about distraction. It's about distracting the British public from the failings in the economy. It's about distracting them from the cost of living crisis, from the energy crisis, from Liz Truss's failed budget in September, from 13 years of austerity. So I think, even across Europe, we can see with, the rise of the far right in Greece or in Italy, all of these countries are using migrants, for want of a better sort of phrase, as a political football. They're using them, to distract the voters, to move people's eyes away from what really matters. And actually, when we talk to people and when we campaign with people at JCWI, what we find is people across the country are overwhelmingly and much more pro-migration. We saw the Ukraine scheme and we saw the Homes to Ukraine, which was taken up massively across the country. People were opening their homes to people from Ukraine. I mean, you wouldn't believe that if you were looking at the policies of the government. The Rwanda scheme on one side, the Illegal Migration Act on the other side from the government, and then the people across the country are opening their homes. I mean, there's a massive distance in the people and the government. So, I mean, whether it's impacted by what happens, whether it's impacted in the way it should be by these tragedies, which is to have a humanitarian lens and to think, wow, people are being massively affected and dying, risking their lives. The Channel is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. People that are going to cross that in a dinghy, an inflatable boat. What a scary thought that is. They must have literally no other choice to do that. And instead of thinking, we should extend the hand of welcome at a government level, what people are thinking is, we should be more cruel and we should dehumanize them more and we should use them to try and bank some more voters in the next general election. I mean, so that's what I think in terms of a policy space from the government. In terms of the public are more and more pro-migration. Of course, the toxic narratives that are put out by the government are going to have an impact. But polling has shown that, we are more pro-migration than ever before. So I think there's a bit of a split between the two that's important to recognise.
What's your view on that in terms of Europe more generally? I mean, as well as writing the book, you work for a kind of Europe-focused think tank, and we know that millions of people are on the move, right? Whether it be from war, famine,
we mean
climate
politically,
change,
the sort of political analysis of what it means.
Is there any emerging consensus on how Europe as a whole deals with this unprecedented movement of people?
Well, I think we can see how, I think there's a really interesting kind of story to talk about politically, and I'm speaking as an analyst here, not so much as the author of the book, so the book is not my views on Europe, I think we've sort of seen this trend over the last 20 years across different European countries where centre-right, neoliberal conservative parties have progressively been replaced or eaten up by right-wing, anti-immigration, populist parties. In some countries that trend is more advanced, such as in Italy, where the government is led by one of them. In some, such as in Spain, the elections just happened, the Vox far-right party didn't quite have the breakthrough some analysts might have predicted, but I think we should just kind of cool ourselves here and go, these guys didn't even exist 10, 15 years ago politically, and now we're going, oh yeah, well they're making coalitions, they're not that important. Come on. In France, which really is the crucible of Europe, France is the key deciding country for how Europe evolves politically. Macron appears as a politician to break left or right and secure French liberalism and economic neoliberalism and the French elite and its understanding of its place in Europe, and now has found himself basically fighting a never-endum against Marine Le Pen and the French far right. In Germany, we've seen. But
Marine Le Pen's been about to win the next election for the last 20 years.
Well, let's have a look at the percentages. The percentages go up every single time. I remember when I was a teenager, her father got. I believe it was 17%, it could be one up or one below. And now we're looking at her going from 30% to potentially 48, 49%. You can say, oh yeah, well she's been about to win the election for both of our lives, but she's the opposition. Yeah. She has established herself there. It's totally possible that somebody else could emerge. She could be swept right, but there is a trend line here. And obviously there are certain analysts, I'm not naming names, that get a bit excited about this and prophesize the immediate takeover. But there's definitely clearly a trend there. And that's why I think Italy is so interesting. It's like, what happens when these guys take over? Like, what happens You know, what happens when they take over is the old joke that all fascist revolutions in Europe begin in Italy. One of the things that's so fascinating about Meloni is that she now finds herself in power, and she's confronted by the fact that actually, if you want to deliver on anything for your voters in terms of bringing inflation down, providing them with people look after them in old people's homes, or just labour to make sure that the prices for the food they buy isn't kind of shooting up, then actually you need migration. And Meloni is marrying this blood-curdling rhetoric with actually setting up schemes for hundreds of thousands of people to come in from outside the EU to work in Italy. So that's a really fascinating trend for me. And another trend that is really interesting to me in trying to imagine how the future of Europe works politically is this anti-migration backlash that's happening in Tunisia. We usually think of there only being one side of the Mediterranean, or this huge pressure of migration coming from the Middle East and especially Africa, concentrating on the southern shores. What we've seen is all of these narratives of the great replacement, of migrant settler colonialism going viral in Tunisia, and Tunisian politics and Tunisian forces attempting pushbacks into the desert there. Meanwhile, we have Team Europe, that's sort of von der Leyen and Charles Michel, encouraged by Meloni, doing deals with the Tunisian government in order to better securitise that border. So I think that, you know, Italy and Tunisia give us maybe a sense of where Europe could be in 5 or 10 or 15 years after Le Pen or somebody like Le Pen wins, or somebody like the AfD enters coalition, or maybe the AfD itself enters coalition in Germany. The German Conservative Party has just said it's open on a local level to work with the AfD. And I think it's exactly what you said about populist rhetoric. That's going to stay. What are they going to do? They're probably going to couple it with actually increasing legal migration from the rest of the world, whilst turning North African countries into an even more explicit version of what they've already been doing to a certain extent, which is a kind of barrier to the south to prevent kind of uncontrolled migration coming from Africa. So I think that's the big picture there of what I think Europe could look like in 10, 15 years.
I'm going to come to any questions from the audience in a minute, but one question which, for any of you really, just back on the subject of the Mediterranean crossings, it's estimated that maybe 2,000 people have died so far this year trying to make that crossing. Why is it still so bad? Is it lack of resources to help? Is it a lack of compassion? Is it a lack of care? Is it a combination of all three?
Probably yes. I mean, there's many different reasons that people die, but I mean, a lot of it is the absence of kind of safe and legal routes is the thing often used. But I mean, sometimes people get frustrated, or that it's not an option available to them. So yeah, I mean, people are taking increasingly dangerous means to get to Europe. You know, the fishing trawler was one of them. Because of the fact that Greece has taken a very hard stance against people arriving, which doesn't just mean not allowing boats to enter their waters. It actually means people will arrive on the Greek islands, they're rounded up. The Greek authorities deny this, but there's evidence, multiple even footage of it happening. People are rounded up by masked men, they're stripped of their belongings, they're sometimes beaten, then they're taken back out to sea by a Coast Guard boat and left adrift in a life raft in the Aegean, and then they're picked up by the Turkish Coast Guard. So this has made it back to some people. People now try and take a more dangerous route from Turkey, bypassing Greece completely to Italy, which there has been shipwrecks along this route. So from my perspective, it's a combination of many different things, but people are taking increasingly dangerous routes. It doesn't really stop people coming, strengthening borders, whatever that looks like. It just means that people pay higher figures to get here and will end up boarding a boat of 700 people. It ends up capsizing. Don't know if anyone else has anything more to add, but yeah.
I think there's really a very, very simple thing, which is that there's a lack of respect for the sacrality of human life. You know, there is a prevailing attitude, culturally and politically, these lives don't matter. And that's why I think kind of what you've been doing is so important. And one of the reasons I tried to write this book, which is to show people that these aren't just numbers, these aren't just kind of arrows on a map shooting upwards. These are every single person is a whole world, as we all know, and some of them thousands of these people are drowning. And I don't think there is I think we've become so numb to it, so used to living in this kind of fraying and in a lot of ways very violent continent, that we've lost our ability to be shocked.
It reminds me a bit of the reaction to mass shootings in the United States. The kind of something must be done, and then it's all forgotten about until it happens again.
And you know what? Something that has been said a lot about the United States is that after Sandy Hook, come in, mow down children at school, that was it. Nothing was ever going to happen because the population had accepted politically on some level, didn't care about it enough in order to do the really difficult thing, which was getting gun legislation in. So we need to ask ourselves, is what has just happened with this tragedy in Greece, is that our Sandy Hook? Was that our moment where we kind of knew about it, scrolled down, politically, culturally, individually, ethically, morally? So I guess that's my question to be tasked this evening.
And some questions from the audience. Yeah, one here, and then let's take... I'll give the microphone here. If you did the one at the back, and then there's one here, and we'll come to you. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess you're kind of talking there about that idea of being desensitized to events, but I wonder whether you think that we're going through the same process with policies. We've had the Rwanda policy now. I mean, I know it's not actually come into fruition yet, but it's... Yeah. Do you think that as more and more of these populist parties come into power in Europe, if they do, and they kind of propose these more radical ideas, that we are as a population going to become more and more desensitized to those kind of...
So I don't think that these populist parties are going to come in and enter the kind of various kind of palazzos and kind of chancelleries of Europe and then start a zero migration policy. Because the moment you do that, your inflation rates shoot up, your ability to provide labour shoots up. These are ageing societies, they don't have the workers, and we live in such tight times, such tough times economically, that people can get it into their head that they might have to pay £10 on their car in order, because of some environmental cost, not voting for those guys. So the populists know that. They need to win elections, they need to take power. So I think what they're going to do is this hypocritical strategy, where they're going to actually issue a really large number of work visas. I think they're going to mine, especially Ukraine, for its population. I think they're going to mine Turkey, potentially even Turkey, North Africa for labour. I think it's going to be done in ways that we're quite uncomfortable about. I think that these populist parties talking in 5-10 years, you asked about the future, I think they're going to look to how labour is organised in successful societies of the 21st century, like in the Gulf, and see these various techniques there. So I think there's going to be more migrants coming through. Will they have less rights? Interesting, maybe, probably. And it's going to be coupled with this very savage attitude that anybody trying to enter illegally is some kind of invader, is some kind of criminal. And what I think is going to happen is the authoritarian regimes of North Africa, not very nice people, needless to say, which are embracing their own version of anti-immigrant politics, are going to find it really quite easy to work with the likes of Maloney or whatever will come to succeed the current generation of politicians in Spain or in France. So the question for Britain is, if that's where we're going 10, 15 years, Brexit has sort of kind of put us a little bit out of kilter. Like, it looks like we're going to be going into a liberal Labour government, just as Macron is waving bye-bye. Where are we? Where does that leave us? I think that, and I know you're going to fiercely I know you guys are campaigning against these kind of policy ideas, and I'd love it if you tell the audience why. But there's one idea that's being shopped around by some, fixers for German politicians about the Stop the Boats stuff, in which the UK could agree to a returns agreement with the European Union. So that's basically the EU-Turkey returns agreement going global, being applied to all frontiers. In exchange, the UK would agree to take a certain number of very vulnerable refugees every year. That could be potentially the equal amount of that. So that could be that's quite an interesting idea politically for both sides, because it allows a British Prime Minister to literally stop the boats, and it allows the Europeans to integrate Britain into that sort of resettlement system, that they can get the British to take 50, 100,000 of very vulnerable people a year. So I think there's going to be more, I think I don't really believe in the viability of some of these more kind of florid, crazy right-wing ideas, judging by what they do when they're in power. I think we're going to see more things like that.
From Britain?
I think I'll come back just on the desensitisation point a little bit. I think we're at a bit of a worrying moment because I think there's a few things here in like this cocktail of toxicity. There's social media, which brings you really close to everything, yet you're extremely far from it as well. So you can see everything that's happening all over the world. You can see climate crisis, you can see Greece on fire, you can see people drowning in the most horrible ways, and then you can swipe off and you can see something else. So what is that doing to us as like people? What is that doing to us? Well, we can see everything and we can swipe off. So it's almost like we see everything, we know everything that's happening, but will we act? Where does the action happen? And where do people say, oh, I've seen this happen and I'm really annoyed and upset about it, but actually I can just swipe to the next TikTok or I can swipe to the next Instagram post. So that's a bit of a worrying thing in terms of actually are we being desensitized to the human loss that's happening here? And I think it's even happening in the Med, the fact that, there's Greek coast guards or Libyan coast guards who can watch people drown in front of them. They can comfortably watch that happen. I mean, that's not a human response. And we've seen through multiple events of history when there's massive trauma, when you look at genocides and the people that carry out these acts, they are so desensitized to what happens and what they do. But 20 years later, they have this reckoning and it all comes back and it hits them and they think, wow, I was part of all of this. And I think those Greek coast guards or Libyan coast guards that are watching this are going to have a moment as well. And there is going to be some sort of a moral reckoning at some point where we all think, how has this happened? How have we allowed this to happen? And it's quite difficult for us, sitting in the UK watching all this, because it's like we see it and we might be really angry and really upset. And then we might have skyrocketing bills and other things that we need to deal with. So it's about, for me, building those communities and building that solidarity among people, which we all have. We all have that amongst us here. That's why we're all here today. We're all comfortable sitting in a room next to each other because we're comfortable. We like community. That's what humans do. So I think there is a worrying thing around, is it desensitization or is it, we see things, we see so much trauma and then we just fail to act. And to be honest, it shouldn't be all of our responsibility to act either. It should be the politicians, it should be the policymakers. I mean, that's, again, as a campaigner, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people who have the power to act to do what they need to do. But it's, we're taking on a lot of trauma. We factually are taking on, this is traumatic. This discussion we're having, the things that we're talking about is heavy. I mean, the things that you both do in terms of what you look into, it's heavy stuff. So, we're constantly taking on, whether it's because we're campaigning, whether it's because we're working, whether it's because we want change. So there is something, I think you are right, that there's something in that, definitely.
Okay, so the woman at the back.
Yeah. Hi, I run an organisation centering the impact of migrant experience on mental health. And I just wanted to ask, from the perspective of those of us who may be in leadership positions in organisations that support people from asylum seeker or refugee background, what are some things that we should be considering in our strategy to provide a better service?
Okay, and then we'll just take the question here.
Yeah, my question was more on, I guess, more of an economics and political standpoint as well. How do you see the development of some countries in Africa, for instance, in Botswana, as a solution to curbing the flow of migration and those victims that try to flee their country and go to Europe for a more prosperous future? And what is the timeline to that you think that can be happening? And what does Europe do, either as individual country or as a bloc, to collaborate with those countries in Africa to push that development?
Okay, so should we do the mental health issues first? And there's, I guess, a British example and a Greek example, which we can talk about.
I didn't see where you were, but I
Right
feel your
back.
voice. Oh, yeah, over there, okay. Well, I think I'm going to end up saying things you probably already know anyway, but I think, in terms of providing that service, you have to be human-centred. You have to, think about the people that you're talking to. You have to not be extractive. I think, one massive problem that you have in the charity sector, the NGO sector, is people are quite extractive. They hear stories and they want to just take it, or they think, how can we benefit from this? How can our organisation benefit? Maybe you can use their case study to get more funding or something like that. So definitely not that, but I'm sure you're not doing that anyway. And then I think it's also important to look after yourself and your staff's well-being, because if you're not able to have that self-care when you're taking on that trauma, and your staff and your organisation are taking on that trauma, then it's just going to be a cycle. You won't be ready, you won't be able to really provide the care and the services you need to provide. So I think those are two main things. Maybe there's some other things that we can discuss if they come to my mind, but yeah, I'm not sure if you have anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously speaking from a journalistic perspective. I don't really have much to add apart from the fact that, journalism can be incredibly extractive. I've seen people's stories, particularly, it can be really, sometimes, I really hate other journalists. It's extractive and sometimes by nature, but I mean, the latest investigation I just worked on felt it's really difficult and uncomfortable, and I think I try to remind myself that no one owes you their story or anything, in fact, and try to work and save comfortable environments where people feel safe, able to share if they want to or not, but also make sure people also have care and psychologists available to them, which probably seems, of course, here, but in some of the contexts I work in, particularly in places like some of the camps or places people are living in Greece, is not always immediate. So there is an aftercare obligation as a journalist, which you have to people who share your stories, and also to yourself as well.
Can you address the question here? I mean, I guess
Definitely,
it's partly, isn't it, that migration is not going to end until people don't want to leave the countries of origin. But, and how do you fairly develop those
Actually, a quick thought about mental health.
Good.
Is, I think, one of the things that I really learned, writing this book on Europe and the one on London, is, it seems sort of obvious saying it, but that they're more religious than the average person in this room. The migrants and refugees who are coming from Africa and Asia, trying to look for a new home. And I think there's often a tendency with NGOs to be a bit frightened or suspicious of the mosques or of the church groups, where these people can find a huge amount of solace. So I guess that would be my advice. Like, don't be frightened or don't be frightened of them, and try and work with that kind of that worldview. I say that as a religious person myself, but I think that I think that's really something that's really important. I think for a lot of people. And now on the question of the sort of brutal hard facts of the economy. I hate to say it, because I hate to be Mr. kind of bad news guy this evening, but I think there are a couple of really big structural trends that are diminishing the importance of democracy and human rights in Europe's geopolitics right now. First is migration, which is the scale of migration that's coming in, the way politicians think that they have to deal with it, is very clearly, as we've been discussing this evening, downgrading the importance of human rights as regards to frontiers. And the second major trend is climate change and the quest for net zero. Like, what is net zero? Is decarbonisation. What is decarbonisation? It's ultimately an industrial process. What is an industrial process? It's mining. What net zero is ultimately is mining African countries and Southeast Asian countries and Latin American countries for cobalt and lithium and uranium and all kinds of resources. So we've got a dynamic now establishing itself with principally with Africa right now, where European countries are trying to lock in long-term deals to guarantee supply of what's going to be in your next car or your next car. And that is incentivizing European governments to downgrade, whether the meeting is not, when the meeting takes place with the leader of that country, item number 2 on the agenda is not going to be, could you release the opposition chief, sir? It's going to be, can you make sure that the cobalt will arrive on time? Thank you very much. So we are replicating through decarbonisation, and we have no alternative, through a lot of the dynamics we actually have towards hydrocarbon countries, towards countries in the Gulf. So I guess when thinking about decarbonisation and net zero in its international implications, you know, it'd be very interesting for kind of progressive spaces like this to think about how can that be made more progressive? How can we kind of insert more democratic elements to that, and make sure that the money and the profits from that essentially extractivist mining process can end up more evenly distributed in those economies, and also that those economies get elements of the value chain, that some part of the electric car can be made in that country, and not simply that the resources are shipped out on a Tuesday morning by train or by boat.
Okay. A question here. Do you want to give the microphone? She's going to be that. This one here. We'll take two at a time. I'm coming to you others.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, please.
Hi. I think one of the biggest things in messaging on people who are crossing the on the Med is a distinction. There's not just a labour force there. Migration is not just taking place. These people are potentially refugees. They are seeking refuge. They're seeking protection. And until we don't address that and we don't get our governments to acknowledge the elephant in the room, we're not going to get very far. And we're still in a context where, at least in the UK, we've just passed successively 2 bills, which are now acts of parliament, both NABA, now the Illegal Migration Act, which don't address it but rip up the European Convention. So until that doesn't get, how far do we go? And how far can we bring about change?
So actually, my question also touches on the illegal migration bill. And I think to your point, Ravishaan, you were talking about how, there's a bit of a, it's kind of used as a political decoy to a certain extent. I actually was wondering, because I think there's some talks, from my understanding, as to how unworkable the bill actually is to implement in practice. What are your thoughts with regards to the fact that this bill is actually extremely hard to implement? Is there actually an angle where it gets implemented to the full extent of what it says on the bill? And if it does, what do you think would be the actual impact on the flow that we see with regards to migrants and also modern slavery?
Do you want to have obviously, as you say, the illegal migration bill is now the law of the land, and the UN has condemned it as breaking international human rights law. Where do we go with it now? And then perhaps after that, Katy, I'm interested in the notion of whether in Greece people sort of believe in the notion of giving refuge, or whether it's all about the economics of people coming.
Well, in terms of... I hate the Illegal Migration Act, of course. So, I mean, in terms of how workable it is, actually, I'm going to split the question a little bit. What impact will it have on stopping the boats was the end bit of the question. I think all of these legislative deterrents, they have very little impact. People aren't checking the news. They're not checking to see what the UK's immigration policy is. There's a few things that the government think and say are deterrents. They say that their policies and their laws are deterrents, and then they also run these digital propaganda campaigns, so digital adverts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. And those campaigns are saying, if you come, you're going to be deported. If you're coming, you're going to be returned. And they also threaten extreme things like you're going to die. They basically do talk about the extreme realities of what it is like to cross the channel, but they're extremely horrific. It's not the sort of things that any government should be doing. I think it's been proven that, a year ago we had the Nationality and Borders Act, and then a year later the government are telling us it's rocket amount of channel crossings. What's the correlation there? The Act clearly didn't stop people coming across the channel. And again, with this Act, I don't think it will stop anyone coming across the channel because they're just not going to see it. In terms of the impact that it will have, it's a disgusting piece of legislation. I mean, we can no longer say that the UK is a leader of human rights because of that act. It goes against, the Refugee Convention. It goes against the European Convention on Human Rights. In my opinion, the government are using this to have a face-off with the European Court of Human Rights and then be able to scrap the convention, scrap the Human Rights Act 1998, and then bring in their new Bill of Rights, which they've been talking about every now and then. So in terms of how workable it is, one of the things they wanted to do is basically force the Rwanda the Rwanda scheme through this act. They're not going to be able to do that because there's an ongoing court case around Rwanda, so that's not going to happen until that court case is settled. There's potentially going to be a May 24 general election if they go for a summer election. So I mean, in terms of the timeline from now until then to get the Rwanda scheme off and running, and then to be able to sort of bait their base, as I believe they want to do, in saying, you know, we've been able to deport X amount of people to Rwanda. I don't think that's going to be possible. In terms of detaining people, which includes children, includes women, potentially pregnant women, absolutely disgusting stuff that they want to do. I mean, there's a potential that could happen in this time frame, and that will be absolutely horrendous. Is that workable? I mean, in terms of the asylum housing that we have at the moment, whether it's hotels, new barges that they're trying to set up, the capacity is not there. You know, they talk about this number, 7 million or 6.8 million a day on hotels. That's the government that have done that. That's because they don't have good policies to house people, whether it's people who are British citizens or whether it's people that have come here on small boats or come here to seek asylum. They just don't have a plan or strategy. So they're just throwing money at it and throwing money at it. So the Home Office is incredibly inefficient. And I think there are certain elements that are definitely unworkable, other bits that they'll be able to push through potentially, but looking at electoral timelines as well, what they get done in that period is going to be, potentially minimal. It's all horrible though. Whatever they do get done is going to be absolutely disgusting.
Can we go to Greece?
Yes.
The notion of, are people who arrive seen as refugees, or are they seen as a problem to be dealt with and processed?
I mean, you're right in saying a lot of people who arrive would be considered refugees, would class for refugee status and protection. Again, it depends who you ask about whether, I mean, this notion and labels gets kind of thrown about kind of wrongly often. And this isn't to say the Greeks are incredibly unfriendly and inhospitable, because they're not. I mean, if you speak to people and just see how people respond on the islands, they were going out and rescuing people from the sea. This is not about the Greek population. It's often about Greek policies, which we're seeing also in Croatia and other places. But I mean, in Greece, how far can you go? I mean, in Greece, for example, the Geneva Convention's essentially, in my opinion, in kind of tatters. I mean, the idea that someone who is deserving of status, but even if they're not, right? I mean, the idea that people can be in EU soil in broad daylight, rounded up by a group of masked men, robbed of their belongings and dragged back out to sea. And this has happened hundreds and hundreds of times. I mean, we have so many reports of this. And then officials in Brussels will say, well, then there should be an investigation into this. Let's see what happens. But Greece is seen as Europe's shield, right? It was called that by von der Leyen. It's seen as the kind of, there's military kind of narrative spoken about protecting Europe. So yes, there's still possibilities if you make it to Greece, if you're not apprehended, if you make it to a camp, if you're given the right to have your asylum processed, you can be considered and treated a refugee. There are amazing organizations, legal organizations working in Greece constantly, who are constantly, by the way, attacked for the work they do. It's becoming incredibly hostile. I mean, it's actually scary sometimes reporting from some of these islands, which sounds strange, but is a huge, because the rule of law, which is, upheld so strongly as European values, doesn't really seem to be operating in some of these contexts. And again, it's not just Greece, it's in many other countries. We're seeing reports like this happening of extreme cases of violence, abuses of rights, and the Geneva Convention completely ignored. So, I mean, the idea of how far we can go, I don't know. I mean, it's already gone pretty extreme in my opinion.
A brief thought on this. I mean, for some people, the idea of stop the boats from a government that loves three-word slogans is incredibly popular.
Well, I just wanted to kind of riff off what you've been saying, kind of link back to that, which is, one of the reasons I decided to write this book is to kind of challenge the way we think about Europe, in a country that has a lot of problems with how it thinks about Europe. And normally, when we discuss Europe, we find ourselves falling into kind of two categories. There's either the Europe of the mind, and that's an imaginary zone of stained glass windows and menhirs and sort of memories of summer holidays, That's becoming increasingly distant from the Europe we actually live in. And then there's the Europe of politics. It's the Europe of your Europe. It's the Europe of Macron and the European Union, and it's the Europe of the Commission. And we can think about Europe really as a kind of legal, political system. And I think that it's very, very important to us today to kind of show, as journalists, as activists, as everybody, with their social media accounts, that to show what Europe actually is, and to sort of try and explore and show and expose and celebrate where we can, and there's a lot to celebrate. The Europe that we actually live in. I think we're living in one of these moments where so many of our assumptions of like what is Greece, or what is London, or what is Europe, what is the United States of America, is out of step with reality. And I think we all have to do an effort to kind of get up to date, basically.
Okay, more questions. There's a gentleman here who's had his hand up, and there's a couple at the back.
Thank you all very much.
Two in the back row, sorry, sir.
Yeah. My name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked on transnational crime and on several EU programs, including international cooperation, and along the migrant routes. My question is, are there any signs of optimism that some transit route countries can cooperate to minimize some of the problems? It's a huge problem. It's going to take a long time. And in the specific case of Greece and Italy and the Libyan coast, do you have any comments on Haftar in Benghazi? Because Haftar has powerful friends who have just reiterated their support for him. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take the three questions all together. So there's two at the back as well.
I was wondering whether, Ben, in your tour around Europe for your book, whether you picked up tensions between Greece and Italy, which have the responsibility under the Geneva Convention to deal with refugees, the first port of landing, and countries such as Poland and Hungary, who the EU wants to help take in more refugees, and are pushing back quite heavily on that.
Okay, and then one more.
Thank you. My question was related to the ethical case for fighting for refugees. There was quite a lot of talk on how populist parties have risen in Europe and all the anti-immigrant rhetoric they're bringing to politics, but I think there's not enough talk on how this rhetoric is permeating into mainstream politics. First in the right, but now also in the left, in different countries among Europe. So my question is how to build the ethical case for helping refugees and to make this a question more about ethics rather than just politics.
Okay, transit countries. Transit countries, any takers?
Well, I could do Southern Europe versus Northern Europe.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's I'm really interested in at the moment in thinking about why do different countries in Europe have different attitudes towards migration and migration politics. And really, when it comes down to it, you've got to answer the question of why did those elites in those countries join the EU and what did they think they were going to get out of it? Elites in Greece and in Italy and in Spain, cut a long story short and simplifying, you're going to be angry with me for saying this because it's so crude, felt that joining the EU was locking in liberalism against fascism. It was locking in liberalism against regressive and reactionary politics explicitly in the case of Greece and Spain. And in Italy, the elite has always felt that being part of the EU was crucial to linking it to Northern Europe and not letting it kind of fall behind economically or socially or fall into any kinds of very deep divisions internally. That is not why Estonia and Poland joined the EU. They joined the EU not to take part in a kind of post-World War II kind of fusion of identities, a great liberal project of creating a new European identity. They joined in order to be nation states. They joined in order to stamp their flag and say, we are We're not part of the Soviet sphere, not part of the Soviet Union anymore, and they obviously have a very different attitude politically, those elites, towards migration. I don't think on the European political level that's really fixable, and I think that's and one of the reasons it's going to become even more difficult is Ukraine. Ukraine's struggle, Ukraine's war, Ukraine's quest for its freedom. There's nothing more romantic or powerful for people in Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. And it's a battle to be a nation. It's a battle not to be absorbed into Russia, literally. And when we find ourselves at some point or another with Ukraine entering into, in some form or another, the European political system, that is adding a very powerful ally to the Polish camp, so to speak. So I think we really have to start thinking about what Europe looks like in 2030, 2040, when Kiev is one of the key European capitals.
Interesting also, I think, that you talk about the north-south. When the big issue was economic and the Eurozone crisis, the split was north-south. When it comes to migration and attitudes to immigration, it's kind of west-east, isn't it? You have multicultural societies in Western Europe. In the East, they're very monocultural and aren't welcoming refugees in anything like the numbers that countries like Greece and Italy are demanding.
But it's going in opposite directions. They have, more and more nationalist politics, and obviously very, very understandably, I'm not criticising Ukraine for, the politics of the cultural moment it's in because of the war in the slightest, but it's going in a kind of opposite direction. So a big question for the future of Europe, really for everything, is, I had these discussions with a lot of European politicians actually, is Ukraine is going to end up in some way or another in the European political system. Is it going to end up in the European political system pissed off, angry, thinking that in its hour of its greatest need, the only people who ever did anything for it were the Americans or Boris Johnson, and then with the EU not having paid for its reconstruction, used it as a kind of zone to strip for migrants, potentially place migrant detention camps at one point or another. It's going to enter into that political system angry, almost in revolt against it, which would be basically doubling the Polish problem as it's seen in Brussels? Or is Ukraine going to enter the EU thinking that in its hour of its greatest need, France, Germany, Italy did everything they possibly could for it and paid for its reconstruction and built a modern European country which entices them into liberal cosmopolitanism that those countries see themselves as holding, at least for now?
Okay, so that's the Eastern problem, if you like. Southern Europe, I mean, can you address in some way what is Greece's relationship with transit countries in North Africa? I mean, I think there was a meeting this weekend in Rome hosted by Prime Minister Meloni, which basically brought together European and North African leaders. How much does Greece see the solution being in North Africa?
Well, I would say that's less a kind of... I mean, Greece sees a lot of its solutions in Turkey, to be honest. But in terms of a European perspective, it looks to the EU to try and figure out some of the more intricate details in transit countries in North Africa. I mean, there's a lot of deals being made. People have differing opinions about whether the sort of billions of euros being given to places like Niger are actually effective. I mean, there's an untold number of people disappearing in the desert, transiting through Niger up to Libya and Algeria. I mean, some people say it could be even deadlier than the Mediterranean, but people disappear. So I don't know. It's a complex question. I mean, Greece is really dependent on the EU. For many things, effectively. But as long as people, I mean, its biggest issue is with what it feels, which is that Turkey sort of sends people across to destabilize its borders. That's often a narrative put forward. But in terms of deals with transit countries, I believe that will probably be more on the agenda moving forward. It's obviously seen now as the solution to stopping people coming, or some kind of way of stopping people coming, but its effectiveness remains to be seen. I mean, there's lots of people who will tell you that you're basically just giving a ton of money to very little effect.
Forgive me, I've slightly forgotten the question, but I think it was a question about the ethical aspect of migration policy. Maybe, Rav, you can have a go at it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think it's a question I was hoping would come up because I think it's really important. I think, it's really important to know how we can build that ethical and moral argument. And, there is a lot of toxicity out there. There's a lot of toxicity towards people who move, towards people who migrate. The fact is, people have moved for centuries. People have always moved. Migration is part of human history. So it's a very common thing. So we need to remember that when we start. The main things to do is to base it in humans and humanity. I mean, like we've said today, the human stories about people who move are really good at connecting people to them. Yeah, they're really good at, putting a face to the numbers, as we've said, because it's not about numbers, this is about real people with real stories, with real lives and real families. And when we realise that, we can connect to them a lot more and we can start to open our arms to them a lot more. So that's something that we need to do. We also need to remind people of our communities. Our communities, especially in the UK, have been built on people who move. The NHS, after World War II, the British government went out to the former colonial countries and they said, we need your help. Can you come back? That whole idea of the Commonwealth. And then they came back and they helped rebuild this country. There were people that were very much part of this country. So migration is a massive part of this country and also a massive part of European history as well. Any of those European nations that were part of a colonial project, Europe basically colonized the whole world, let's not forget, so pretty much all of them will have some sort of a connection to migration post that colonization. So that's important to remember. We have to build coalitions. It's really important to build coalitions with other people, to listen to people. You need to listen to people. You need to understand where they're coming from. What are their concerns? A lot of the times people's concerns, when you ask them, they might say migration. But actually what their concerns really are is paying their bills, or it's, their local library is just shut, or their NHS waiting hours are 9 hours. And maybe there's migrant nurses and doctors in there who are then going to see them eventually. So it's really recentering and really listening and understanding, no, this is what's actually happening, and then refocusing people away from the toxic narratives that they've been told, which are really easy to swallow up. They've been used for centuries as well. Scapegoat or point to someone else and blame them. That's really obvious. And then the other thing is, bringing people with you. Bring people with you, stick together, keep talking to people. We are, as humans, we like to talk, which is why we attend events like this. We like to hear from each other. You need to continue to talk to people. You need to continue that grassroots activism and build those narratives into your communities, whatever communities they may be. So I think those are the main things that we need to do collectively if we want to sort of build a moral and ethical argument. Definitely centering people, centering those stories. I'm looking forward to reading your book, Ben, because it's the centering of the stories is really important. I mean, as a little plug for us, join our campaign and join our movement as well, because there's lots of people that are very similar to you that care about other people and they want a progressive future. They want a solution to this. We can find a solution and we can do it together.
Okay, we're beginning to come towards the end of our allotted time, but there's a question at the table over there, and then there's a gentleman here. I will give you this microphone. Yes, please. Is that one on? Can you hold the microphone a bit closer? I don't think it's working. It's not working. Hang on.
Okay.
Oh, we've got two.
Oh, okay.
This one definitely.
Oh, yeah. Let's go to the front. Sure.
Go ahead.
My name is Warda, and I run a charity that supports children in care. And I understand that all these hostilities that we're talking about have essentially led to a two-tier system when it comes to particularly teenagers in care, where British kids are treated one way and unaccompanied minors are treated with contempt and suspicion. But what I'm not ready to accept is that this has also trickled down to really small children. But it must do, because the Home Office continues to house, like you mentioned earlier, these children in these hotels where they're being exploited by traffickers and human harvesters, and no one seems to be doing anything about it. So I just want to ask you, how can we lobby against this? Because these children, they're really small, and they should be in social care, not the Home Office running this sort of thing. So is this part of your campaign?
Thank you. And we'll take one other question.
My question is about reframing some of the conversation around migration in terms of, like, I was taking an Uber the other day and I discovered that my Uber driver was a surgeon in the country that he came from. And I actually came to this country as a doctor, and it was very difficult to become requalified to work here on the NHS. It honestly, and I know a lot of other medical professionals who are interested in coming here who find the system so unwelcoming that they go to New Zealand or they go to Australia. And meanwhile, the NHS has 60,000 vacancies. And there are refugees in this country who have the skills that are needed. But refugees are just seen as a cost center. Like, oh, we have to pay so much and we have to house them and all this. Why are we not both helping them build a life here and also, frankly, leveraging those skills that this country desperately needs?
Yeah, I thank you for both of those questions because they're both really powerful. Any comments any of you want to make? And we're kind of making your wrapping up comments as well, but obviously children, I mean, wherever you go to anywhere in the world to a refugee camp, it's always the children that seem to suffer the most. So it's a really fair question. And sir, your question as well.
Yeah, again, it's just disgusting what the Home Office are doing to people that have come to this country seeking a better life and have sometimes very little idea of what awaits them when they get here. In terms of children, we saw in the South Coast a lot of children go missing, and there was a bit of media coverage on that, and then it just totally died out, that story. In terms of campaigning in that aspect, is the main things to do is to really start local campaigns in terms of like lobbying MPs, trying to get MPs across with that. In terms of our work, we do campaign across a lot of areas. We haven't had a massive focus on that area at the moment, but because we have quite a broad campaigning and advocacy wing, it is something that we do take on, and it's something that we're looking to push further. The fact of children, and I'll sort of mix it with this messaging question. So when you talk about children, it's a very emotive thing. People can sometimes, for some reason, accept that things happen to adults. They can definitely accept that things happen to men, men of a fighting age, because it's been used in such a toxic way. But to children, people find it a lot harder to understand, even still, that story just kind of went missing as well. So it is important that we continue to campaign on that, because it's just disgusting that can happen in our country. How can that happen in the UK, the 6th richest country in the world? A country that speaks of itself as a leader in human rights, and children are just going missing. That's just disgraceful. In terms of framing and messaging, I think you're right. This country's immigration policy is completely. It doesn't make any sense. Like you said, there's a massive skills gap and skills shortage across sectors, whether it's in the NHS, whether it's in farming, whether it's anywhere. You can look at any sector, there's a massive skills gap. I think you're right, we need to bring that into the conversation, and we need to definitely highlight the fact that this government is incredibly,
It's wasteful, frankly, it's wasteful.
Yeah. Incredibly wasteful, incredibly chaotic in terms of the policy that it puts out, and in terms of the way that it treats people that move here. It seeks to demonize people that move here, when people that move here, like we've said a lot of times, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but they come here for a better life. They come here a lot of the time because they want to rebuild their lives, and they, like you said, they had a life back home which was flourishing. They didn't actually necessarily want to leave that life for many reasons. They were happy there, but whether it was a human rights crisis, whether it was war, whether it was climate change, for some reason they had to move. They saw no other reason than to move, and they want to rebuild that. They're actually living in sometimes a lot worse circumstances here than they were previously. So you're right, there is a lot of work we need to do with reframing that, and making sure that we are changing the idea that people in this country, some people in this country, and the government certainly tries to make people in this country think about people who move here.
Katy?
Yeah, I agree. I think actually the media has like a huge role to play in this, and one that it fails to play consistently, which is the way in which it speaks about people and demonizes people and sort of uses labels, abuses labels, migrant, refugee, blah, blah. I mean, it's definitely important about the stories we all choose to tell and framing them, and I think that's crucial. I mean, all the people it's just people in the end, you know, it's people on the move, it's people, we're all the same, you know, the people who were in this boat were writers, poets, artists, doctors, surgeons, everything, you know. I mean, one of the Pakistani survivors I met was an artist, and the first thing we did after speaking was we went to an art shop and he bought some art supplies, and, you know, these stories, we need to, I as a journalist have to keep thinking about how I tell people's stories, and the media has a huge role to play because especially some of the right-wing media, it just immediately goes to stereotypes of young single men, etc., etc., and we need to really kind of rebel against this because it is part of a very toxic narrative and leads to the sort of demonization of a whole, of just human beings, and leads to sort of abuses of rights and the dehumanization and being able to feel like you can do things like watch people drown because you don't see people as humans, you don't see that.
Final thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to kind of thank again everybody for the work that they've been doing. It's just so inspiring, and to thank everybody in the audience. That so many people here are really just doing such incredible work. You know, really just wanted to say thank you. And I guess in terms of some final thoughts, I think there's a danger in what I guess we're all doing of seeing this in isolation and trying to work towards creating better conditions for migrants and refugees in isolation of a wider social project to build a more just and a more functioning society in Europe at this point. And I think that the migrant refugee rights movement, you know, risks not realizing the link in kind of in voters' minds and being vulnerable because there isn't a kind of strong enough sense of that project. You know, we got. You know, I think that Europe is transforming demographically, racially. It's becoming a completely new society, and I think the migrant and the refugee is essential in order to be able to see it, both of its power structures around what its borders are, how it uses violence, like what its actual economy is in terms of how its kind of new class or caste system functions. And I think that we should recognise that millions of Europeans are very frightened of this new society that's emerging. They're frightened about technology. They're frightened where they're being told every day, both you have to accept large amounts of migrants because you don't want to do the jobs, and oh yeah, by the way, all your jobs are going to disappear because of AI. Sorry, there's nothing you can do about it. You know, people are very frightened about the society that we are moving into, and a lot of millions of voters all across Europe are, you know, voting frantically, trying to defend the little that they have. And I think that people on the, you know, liberals and human rights defenders and migrant defenders and refugees defenders, I think we need to present this as part of a wider agenda to build a new Europe with, you know, more and more just, safe, secure and green jobs, more and more, you know, comfy, beautiful, green houses. Like, we can't be in a situation where we are admitting, you know, say about 1 million migrants a year to the UK, most of them arriving to the southeast of England, and building 42,000 houses in London. It's just unsustainable. Like, we have to, you know, I don't think any of our problems that we've kind of, and their problems, you know, that we've identified this evening we're going to be able to resolve them without that bigger, you know, push for a more social democratic and just society in Europe.
Well, we've covered quite a lot of ground in just over an hour and a quarter, so there's a lot to talk about afterwards. I'm sure Ben will be very happy to sign copies of his book at the table at the back.
I certainly will.
And all that remains missed, thank you all for coming, and to thank Rav, Katy and Ben for talking to us this evening.